Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Benjamin, and today we're actually talking about one of my more favorite bits of American history, even though it's kind of unimportant if we're being 100% honest. And the reason why it's my favorite is because of how weird it would sound to a foreigner who's studying American history. And while I say it's kind of unimportant, there are some very important, there is some important fallout from this event. And this is the Whiskey Rebellion that we're talking about, right? And I think I've talked about this, and I talked about it very briefly, kind of a while back, in a video probably a few years ago. But I think I was using that as kind of a way to say that no, the American Revolution really was just about taxation, not taxation without representation. And I say this because if you look at the immediate aftermath of the revolution, it comes down to, you have Shays' Rebellion, a tax revolt. You have the Whiskey Rebellion, a tax revolt. And in some ways, the election of Andrew Jackson, the rise of the modern Democratic Party, not the modern Democratic Party, but the organization that is now currently the Democratic Party, you could argue that that was in some ways a political revolution against taxation. And while they all say, well, we had no representation, that's in some cases debatable. Whether it was fair representation is a different story altogether. But in Western Pennsylvania, these areas did get representation in Congress, in the federal Congress. In the state legislatures in Massachusetts, the western parts of the state that rebelled under Shays' Rebellion, they did have representation in the state legislature. The issue, though, is that despite this representation, they were getting laws passed that were specifically, at least in their eyes, were specifically meant to spite them or harm them. For example, in Shays' Rebellion, it was, well, they couldn't pay their taxes because you couldn't barter or trade goods to pay taxes. You had to pay in hard currency, which the farmers out there didn't have. And in Pennsylvania, the reason, and this was actually true in parts of Kentucky, in parts of Tennessee, the Appalachian regions of Virginia and North Carolina, and really just everything west of the fall line, you had a lot more opposition to the whiskey tax. And I want to go more in depth into, what the whiskey tax was, how it worked, talking a little bit more about the federal response, some of the events that go on, and the fallout than I maybe did the last time I talked about the Whiskey Rebellion. So the tax was designed, spoken for, and endorsed by Alexander Hamilton, the Secretary of the Treasury. And the reason why Hamilton went for a tax on distilled spirits, what we now call the whiskey tax, was because he actually thought that tariffs had been risen high as they reasonably could, which I think that's a fair assumption when somebody who is generally pro-high tariffs says we've raised them high enough. He probably already raised them too far, but hey, credit where it's due. He was like, yeah, we can't have tariffs that are too high, because we're going to get less revenue from them because other countries aren't going to trade with us. Americans aren't going to buy imported goods. Basically, you could say that comment, haha, libertarian Laffer curve argument, but the Laffer curve actually does have some validity, and I'll talk about that when we get to supply side economics in the 1920s. You heard that right. Supply side wasn't invented by Reagan. In fact, Reagan did a voodoo version of supply side. Anyway, looking at what excise tax you could implement in America, one of the things that Hamilton wanted to do was he didn't want to tax something that was extremely popular, used a tremendous amount, or generally speaking wouldn't be a good that everybody used, because that would harm poorer people. And he considered distilled spirits to be a luxury item, so that's why he chose this to be an excise tax. And he got early temperance movements on board because they were like, hey, this will get people drinking less, so we'll endorse this. Yeah. Anyway, the problem was Hamilton didn't understand the economics of any place that wasn't a major city or trading hub. See, Hamilton was great at balancing a budget. Yes, he incurred a tremendous debt when he consolidated all the individual state debts from the Revolution to a federal debt, but he actually wanted to pay off most of it, because in his eyes that would increase American credit, because countries will be willing to loan us money if we can actually demonstrate that we can pay it back. So that's what Hamilton did. He wanted to keep the books and budget balanced. The problem was he didn't understand why grains were being distilled in the West. The issue was there were, hilariously, unfair tax breaks to large distillers who were based in the East. And the big problem was that they also distilled whiskey, not just, I'm saying whiskey, but it included other distilled spirits, but they were distilling it not just to drink, even though consumption was definitely a reason. They distilled their spirits, they distilled their grain in spirits so that they could transport their grain to market, because if they didn't, the grain would rot or even sprout. But it was typically one of the two, and that's not good. You can't make a living with rotting grain. So they would distill it so they could transport their grain to market. In addition, they would distill it because it was used as a means of exchange. It was used as a currency. Hey, I want some shoes. Do you take payment in whiskey? Cool. Here's your whiskey, thanks for my shoes. Pretty simple, right? And when it was passed, it was actually rather unpopular. And, but, a lot of the resistance, in the East was definitely, peaceful. It was protests or, voting against politicians who supported it. Out West, on the other hand, because it was seen as an attack on their livelihoods, their lives, their ability to, take their grain to market, and even their currency, you saw people attacking tax collectors, burning their homes, and riots. And it wasn't considered let's just say it even got to the point where they tarred and feathered a tax collector in western Pennsylvania, if I remember correctly. Washington County, Pennsylvania. And the truth is, there was resistance basically west of the fall line, which, for those of you who know what American geography, the fall line is basically kind of where rivers are navigable to. Because above that line, it's all very rocky, it's shallower, and there's a lot of waterfalls, right? But people were wondering, is the federal government going to respond to people outright not paying their taxes? Sorry about that. It's dang telemarketer. Anyway, Washington decided, okay, enough is enough. They have to respect federal authority. So he gathered an army and marched out into the countryside. Now, Hamilton wanted it to be put down by force. Washington, he rode out there because he saw it as his duty as president. And Washington, I don't think, actually wanted violence. He wanted to do a big show of force, convince the rebels, who were actually doing some violence, not just rioting, not just assaulting tax collectors. They were considering, going the Shays Rebellion route. Anyway, Washington rides out there, and, well, the rebels go home. And this actually pretty much ends the revolution, the Whiskey Rebellion, because guess what? Everybody's like, oh, wow, the federal government can actually mount an effective response to these types of things. If I remember correctly, the Insurrection Act was passed in the aftermath of this. And this kind of hastened the creation of political parties in the United States. For example, a lot of these Western farmers, settlers, saw Hamilton as kind of the blame, so they wanted nothing to do with him, and they would support anybody who was anti-Hamilton. So they were drawn to Jeffersons Republicans. And remember, Jefferson's faction, I'm going to be calling the Republicans because that's what they called themselves. They never said we were Democratic Republicans. I think there was actually one who did say, our Democratic Republican Party or something like that. But they were almost always self-styled as Republicans. And this is not to be confused with the modern Republican Party, even though there are parts of their platform which are broadly similar. But that's true of the Federalists and the Republicans. That's true of the old Republicans and the Democrats. And that's true of the Federalists and the Democrats. It's really weird, and you have to recognize that coalitions and party change. Anyway, so what we see is that people kind of accept the Constitution at this point, saying, hey, it actually did its job. And yeah, the polarization into political parties definitely did occur. And Jefferson probably got into office eventually in 1800 because of support from these people who hated the whiskey tax. You could almost say it was the whiskey party movement of the Jeffersonian Republicans, to make an allusion to the Tea Party of nowadays, right? Jefferson did very quickly into his term repeal the whiskey tax. That was one of the first things he did. Of course, Hamilton still thought the tax was a good idea because it's Hamilton. I don't think the man ever saw a tax he didn't like. And believe it or not, only 1 or 2 people were actually hanged for this. Or I think only 2 people were actually sentenced to be hanged for this. And Washington pardoned them both, saying, yeah, they made mistakes. Yeah, they shouldn't have done what they did, but at the same time, they're done. They don't show any inclination of doing it again. They shouldn't be punished. And the Federalists definitely were a little bit less against restrictions on assembly and protest after this. And people were still unsure about what exactly the rights of the people were and what exactly the government could do in certain situations. And there's some very interesting stuff in pop culture about it, but most of it's from that time. There's apparently, and now I'm going to want to actually go there, there's a Whiskey Rebellion Festival in Washington County, Pennsylvania, or I guess Washington, Pennsylvania. I'm going to really want to go there because that's going to be funny. And there's apparently a few songs or 2 about it too, so But generally speaking, it's a kind of unimportant event. I'm being 100% honest here, even though I really do love all the just how crazy it is that Americans actually fought, against a tax on whiskey of all things. Now the reasons for doing so actually make perfect sense when you actually explain it and break it down. But I don't think Alexander Hamilton knew those reasons why this was a very bad policy until it blew up in his face. And So it's kind of that on the Whiskey Rebellion. And I forgot to mention the last video about American history that Washington's main job when Jefferson was in the cabinet was to break up shouting matches between Hamilton and Jefferson. And that's because Jefferson and Hamilton were always at each other's throats, because of course they were. Jefferson would have preferred the Articles of Confederation to remain in place. Hamilton wanted a frickin' monarchy. So yeah, you can see why they may be very much opposed. And Jefferson had a very hard time saying that the French Revolution was getting too violent. I don't think he ever actually did say that. Yeah, and Jefferson actually helped pen France's one of the first French Republic's founding documents. I think it was titled like The Rights of Man or something like that. So Jefferson kind of was invested in the French Revolution as well. So yeah, to talk about two people who really probably shouldn't have been in the same room together, and they quite often were forced to be in the same room. But that's going to be a story for another. But the story for the next time is the Adams administration and the falling out between Jefferson and Adams. Two great friends. And I'm probably going to do a video on the history of Adams and Jefferson, because they were great friends. They had a falling out, and then they reconciled and became great friends again. Anyway, thank you all for watching. I hope you enjoyed. See you all next time. Remember, a like, a comment, and a subscription is greatly appreciated if you're new to the channel. For those of you who've been here for a long time, share it with somebody who might actually enjoy it. See if that happens. See y'all next time. Bye-bye.